Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Marco Marabelli as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Marco Marabelli is a professor of computer information systems and associate director of the Hoffman Center for Business Ethics at Bentley University. He teaches graduate courses in business analytics and doctoral seminars on information system theories and qualitative research methods. His research examines the intersection of technology and social justice, with a particular focus on the ethical implications of emerging technologies such as the artificial intelligence and the metaverse. Institutional inertia in addressing algorithmic misuse and the impact of AI-based automated systems on underrepresented populations within organizations. Dr. Marabelli is co-authoring a forthcoming book on the environmental impact of generative AI and has recently edited a special issue on metaverse ethics in the Journal of Strategic Information Systems. His current projects investigate AI and environmental sustainability, the role of generative AI in academic research, and decision-making processes assisted by generative AI in organizational settings. In today's episode, Dr. Marco discusses key insights from his acclaimed book, AI Ethics and Discrimination in Business, the DEI implications of algorithmic decision making. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Marco Marabelli to the conversation. Dr. Marco, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
It is a pleasure and an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, your book takes a historical view of data and algorithms in businesses. What motivated you to link that history so explicitly to contemporary DEI debates? And what did that perspective reveal that a purely technical view would miss?
Okay, first, thank you for this question. I'm a computer scientist, but I'm not one of these computer scientists that focus just on technology. You know, according to Herbert Simon, computer science is like three things: the artifact, that today is a digital artifact, the algorithms, and then the societal implications of using artifacts and algorithms that process data. And I'm actually I belong to the third part of computer science. So what I study is the social and societal implications of technologies, especially emerging technologies. So but wanting to answer the last part of your question, I think that a socio-technical approach, rather than a technical approach, can better capture nowadays technologies, because probably like 34 years ago, some technologies could be studied in a vacuum, like they were doing something very narrow, like an invoicing software, etc. Today, technologies are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. So they're in organizations, they are in individuals everywhere, because we have phones, there's cameras everywhere. And so not understanding how people use technologies or misuse technologies, this doesn't give the big picture of the good and bad consequences of their use. And the historical perspective, well, yes, my book talks is a. I mean, I come from Europe. I'm originally from Italy, but I've been in the United States for 20 years, and I really realized that technologies and the laws and regulations that govern technologies are very tied to the historical perspective of the United States, which has to do with laissez-faire, has to do with the government not wanting to interfere in what high-tech companies do. And so to really understand why, for example, companies like Meta or Amazon or Google can collect such a massive amount of data, we need to go back to 1 century, 2 centuries ago, to the entrepreneurship approach of United States to committing to breakthrough innovations. So in Europe, they complain because there's too many laws and regulations that prevents people from unleashing technologies into society right away. Well, here, many people complain for the opposite, that technologies are unleashed to society without proper vetting. And this is historical because that's really like in the culture of the United States as a nation where government is used for just minimal functions. Like, there's not public health care. So you want healthcare, go to work and find coverage at your employer. You want services, pay for them. Like there's a very little welfare, very little social state. And so technologies and their use in the United States, I think, are a consequence of this historical perspective specific of this country. And so I read a lot about a country, I read a lot of history, I read a lot of laws, regulations. I really spoke many times with the lawyers who are specifically studying how the law has shaped the development of technologies in the centuries in this country. And so that's why I take a historical perspective, because I try to explain that what happens here, in terms of, for example, data collection, is just reflects the culture of this country that has developed over the centuries.
Professor, you describe machines as operating in binary systems, while societies are fundamentally analogic. Can you unpack this distinction and explain how that mismatch produces new forms of discrimination in organizational decision making?
Yes, this is something that actually I borrowed from two scholars that are very famous in my field, Lee Starr and Bauer, and they wrote a book, a very famous book, I think in 2001, on classification. They explain that the world is not just binary, but the problem, because we have nuances in the world, like colors that are not just yellow, blue, green. They can like mix together, and all the analogic characteristics of the world. And I think that lately with machine learning, with AI, we are really trying to move this analogic world into data, into computers, into digital formats. The problem is that digital is digital, zeros and ones, which is the binary system. And so it can work for some things, but the effort to try and classify anything from the real world into like zeros and ones is a little bit problematic. Like, for example, facial recognition systems are systems that try to understand, if a face matches a person, but they have categories, right? Like everything in computer, you have to. I mean, you have to classify in anything, basically, even in the real world, but computers classify in a way that doesn't really capture some nuances. In fact, if facial recognition system is not trained a lot with certain kinds of faces, like for example with people with dark skin, then they function not well when they try to recognize these people. And they don't have like faces in general. They have white faces, brown faces, black faces. And so this puts people into categories and clearly can lead to discrimination, because then one of the consequences, for example, is that in healthcare, these classifications are used to conduct clinical trials, and the clinical trials are conducted on not always, but very often on people who have insurance. And most likely, white people rather than black people in the United States have insurance. So classification leads to clinical trials on a certain population, which leads to better outcomes in terms of cures and diagnosis that involve the people that have been studied, which discriminates again people already disadvantaged, which are, for example, I mean, in my example, black communities, but I'm talking about other communities that are not necessarily black communities. In the United States, there's a segmentation of population that is huge also because of the nature of this country that has always promoted immigration, let alone the last period, but historically has always been a country welcoming people from abroad. I came from abroad, for example. So that's the issue of analogic and digital.
Professor, as you mentioned, classification is central to algorithmic systems. Yet, you argue it is inherently biased. How do you differentiate between necessary categorization and discrimination classification in real-world AI applications?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think that, as I said before, I mean, we tend to classify everything in life. I mean, we have to. If we pay taxes, to be fair, we have to classify people on the basis of their income. So people, of course, in an ideal world, people who make more money should pay more taxes, right? Has to be proportional. In other contexts, if companies abuse data from users, they are or should be fined with respect to their income. Like that's what happens in Europe, for example. And I have to classify, for example, in healthcare diseases. I cannot have doctors that do everything. So there's specialists for specific diseases, and we have ICD 10, which is a system that in the United States classifies diseases for the purpose of addressing, diseases and provide diagnosis. And this is very good for healthcare. So that's all good. Classifications have to happen. The problem is that at times in the real world, I can decide to do not classify. For example, if I want to represent populations, cultures, I don't have to classify them by where they're from, the color of the skin, their age, for example. But with AI, with the computers, these computers need classification. They don't work without that. They don't understand the life as we do. For example, let's say that we want to teach an AI how to recognize an elephant walking at the zoo, right? We need to feed the system probably with some between 10 and 15,000 photos of elephants. So then they classify each photo, and so they can capture a movement of an elephant and link this with an elephant. A 4-year-old kid can recognize an elephant in the zoo after having seen it in a photo for a second. So that's the power of our brain comparing to the AI. And so our brain doesn't have to classify photograms of an elephant, but we just understand, the meaning of an elephant. AI has to have all of these photos in their database, and so then they can say, okay, in the zoo, that's the elephant, even if sometimes they make mistakes, and we all know the famous AI hallucinations, which is when AI, many people say that when AI hallucinates, they lie. But that would be, I think, giving AI too much agency. So AI doesn't lie. They don't do this purposely. The problem is that I believe everybody knows how generative AI works with a probabilistic approach to generating text, for example. And so sometimes they're just wrong. So they don't lie. They just say things that don't make sense.
Dr. Marco, the book draws on empirical cases from healthcare, social media, and the gig economy. Which case most surprised you in terms of how algorithmic decisions amplified existing inequalities and what made it so revealing?
Well, I think maybe I'm saying something very taken for granted, but because we all know that. But social media is certainly um, an example of how algorithms work in ways that discriminate. And the problem is that, I mean, I don't think any social media company wants to discriminate. I mean, they want to make money. Like their business model revolve around ads. And the more I have people on a platform, the more I can mine data of these people. So the more I can target ads because I know, what people want, what people like. And so basically, instead of just like throwing out very general ads to all the population of a social media, they hit specific people on what they may want to buy. Like it's the difference between putting a big sign of sparkling water on a highway, and so anyone can drive or buy, or sending something about a specific products to a home of a person who uses these products. So targeted ads is key for social media. But the problem is that there are some consequences because the algorithm approaches users trying to generate views. And for example, they don't know if these views are positive or negative. And we see this with hate speech. As soon as an algorithm sees that there's a discussion where people start commenting very fast, very quickly with long comments, that's something that appeals people for an algorithm. And so the algorithm augments the reachability of this post. And sometimes these posts are possible people fight. And so that's why we find a lot of social media posts that are just upfront in our feeds, even if they are maybe pointless, because they're hot posts. And then there's the problem of discrimination that relies on the data that social media has. For example, I think Facebook was famous for having provided ads of houses that could be purchased for people with a certain income, and then other people that, according to Facebook's understanding of their job, were making less money, and so the ads that they had were on houses to rent. So logically, the algorithm was kind of right? If you make a certain amount of money, you may want to buy a house. If not, you may want to rent. But that's discriminatory, right? Because I may make not that money, but maybe my partner makes a lot of money, and I can buy a house, or I want to open a mortgage and I can try to buy a house as well. Or jobs that are more where you can make more money offered to men, and jobs where you can make less money that were offered to women. Why? Because historically the algorithm knows that women have made less money on average than men, and so the approach of the algorithm, in their opinion, is fair, because they hit populations on the basis of historical data and on the basis of what people like and don't like. But at the same time, this is discriminatory, because in this way, we keep the status quo. And so women will keep making less money than men because they will have less opportunities to be exposed to offers of jobs that make a lot of money. So it's not the social media that wants to do bad in terms of discrimination, but it's the business model and the way the algorithm is designed that then lead to all these discriminations. A problem is that, unfortunately, most of social media know that, but don't do anything to fix the problem. So they didn't create the problem, but awareness of the problem and not fixing it is anyway something that is not good practice, at least in my opinion.
Professor, a core theme is the historical penalization of underrepresented groups by technology. What patterns did you observe across the different domains you study that show how past injustices get encoded into current AI systems?
Yes, I think that the main problem, what everybody talks about, is historical data. And a very simple example, if I want to hire people and like, let's say, in a C-suite of an organization, and I use an algorithm that is trained with historical data on past hires from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. If you see a board of directors of the 80s, they're all white old men, right? So an algorithm that is trained with this pattern of data will anyway help people hiring just these people, like same old man. But with AI and generative AI, the problem is a little bit more complex because people realize that historical data is often skewed. And so they try to fix historical data. But generative AI is trained with a huge amount of data, scraped from the internet. And so the discriminatory nature of the data set becomes more implicit. Like, for example, the gold standard of training data or large language models is scraping Wikipedia. Because Wikipedia, English, is well written, most of the content is reliable, and so people think that it's okay and fair to educate algorithms using Wikipedia. Well, first, there's a problem of, I think, intellectual property. You know, I did create some Wikipedia pages, but I never signed off for having a company use what I wrote to train their models. But that's a different thing. The real problem here is that Wikipedia contributors are 90% male, for example, 20-25% white. And so there are implicit biases into all the data of Wikipedia. And then if a machine has been trained with all this data that are really like specific of a Western culture, of a male culture, of a white culture, then clearly the outcomes reflect these implicit biases. And so when I make hiring decisions, I may not see that the algorithm picks specifically white men, but if they have to interpret resumes and statements, they will anyway have a view that advantages people who have been already advantaged historically. And this is challenging because it's much more sneaky to capture. And the problem is that all people, decision makers, always say, well, okay, we let the algorithm make decisions, but then we vet the decisions and we decide whether. The problem is that it's very difficult then to identify how the algorithm has discriminated if the discrimination comes from such a large amount of data, because they become conditioned by algorithms. And one big problem is that the algorithm, from an efficiency perspective, is generally right. So it may be that the algorithm picks the right people and they are men, but we need to prevent this from happening systematically, because otherwise we miss soft advantages of having diversity. For example, let's say that if I hire 10 men, these 10 men have all a higher degree than the women who applied for a leading position. But so the algorithm looks at the resumes and the university where they are from. But having a gender diverse board, for example, is not just about degrees. It's not just about knowledge and preparation. It's also about culture and perspective. So I want to hear perspective from men and from women. And the algorithm doesn't know that. The algorithm looks at hard data, resume, success, previous earning. But that's not the full picture. The full picture includes the value of diversity that comes from just being diverse.
Professor, you emphasize the possibility for underrepresented populations to play an active role in designing automated systems. What concrete governance or design practices do you see as most promising for shifting power in that direction?
Okay, well, shifting power is a dream. It would be like the best thing. It would be empowering citizens and stripping power from companies. Well, I think that first there should be a top-down change in perspective on, for example, data protection, data privacy. Because, for example, in the United States, there's a very famous unregulated industry, which is the data brokers. So here you can go on a highway, you can go with a camera, and you can click and shoot photos to each and every car that goes on the mass pike, for example, capture the plates, collect millions of plates per day, and sell all this information to the police or to a private company that wants to market anything. And there's no law that tells you that you can't do that, because on the highway there's an assumption that you don't have privacy, that everything can be public. So these things have to change, and these things can change only from the top down. So Congress or whoever wants to change this law need to act. The problem is that often lawmakers are not fully aware of how technologies work. And so I understand it's challenging for them to understand when a technology is trouble for citizens. But in Europe, the music is different. But I'm just giving examples of this country. So first, a top-down change with lawmakers being able to regulate some of the aspects of data, because we really still rely on laws that are old. Like, for example, Section 230, which is a famous section of a much broader law, shells social media in the United States, because it says that whatever user-generated content goes online, it's not responsible of the platform. So the user is responsible, because at that time, when Section 230 was generated, social media were different. The users were less able to make disturbing content. They weren't deep fake, porn, or revenge. They were just people who were maybe saying something that others didn't want to hear because they didn't agree with. And so we were talking about free speech. Now we can say that if you generate a deep fake with pornography, with minors, that's free speech. That's clearly not free speech. But still, Section 230 governs social media and shields these companies from any responsibility, from most responsibilities from user-generated contents. So this law has to change. And with this, many other laws that manage telecommunications need to be rethought in light, for example, of generative AI. So the first is the top-down change. And then there's a bottom-up approach that should empower individuals and give individuals some rights, for example, on their data. Like 10 years ago, Facebook used their system to systematically train their facial recognition software using photos where people tag themselves. So if I tag myself in 10 photos, well, that's so good for the facial recognition system software, because they can go through my photos, see different expressions on me, and understand that that's the same person. That's the perfect training for a facial recognition system. But they never asked me to do that. They never give me money. So maybe we should be given money for the data we provide, or maybe we should be able to sign off for any time people uses my data for purposes that didn't match the original purpose for me to upload data. Okay, and so empowering people is kind of complicated, and of course it will result in a loss of revenues. For example, sticking with social media companies, for them, because clearly they will be less able to understand what I like, what I don't like, but they will be less able to make me buy things I don't need, because that's what happens now. And moving from Facebook to Amazon, think about the phenomenon of nudging. Nudging is not always bad, but nudging can be bad when you end up having people buy so many things that they don't need, because it's just exploitation of algorithms and exploitation of these systems that are invasive. And it's different than putting candies near to the cashier at the grocery store, because very cheap items, general purpose items, are purposely put at the end of your path to get checked out in a grocery store. So you are there in line, you don't know what to do, and you pick candies. So that's nudging in the real world. Or where they hide salt at the very end of a store, so you have to go through all the aisles to get salt, because the salt is cheap and the margin for selling salt is minimal, and so they hide salt. So to look for salt, you see other things. That's one thing. But with algorithms, it becomes different, because it's not that all people need to look for salt over there, or all people find candies at the cashier. It's you finding only the kind of candy that you really like in a specific moment of your grocery experience. That's what happens online. So targeted advertisement is the problem, because at that point you really mine what anyone may like, and then if you go on Amazon and you shop and then someone else does it 1 minute after with their profile, they see totally different offers because they were mined in a way that define their preferences. And so that's that's the danger. And of course, this also can be applied to marginalized populations that have a financial hardship, or populations that are more or less discriminated upon.
Professor, this is an interdisciplinary project drawing on anthropology, psychology, sociology, management, marketing, and economics. How did bringing these lenses together change the questions you ask about AI, ethics, and discrimination?
Well, I think that, well, first, the book is interdisciplinary because I try to attract the attention of many fields. And second, because I think all these fields are interconnected. So I'm an information systems person, and so if I study AI, ethics, and discriminations from my perspective, I would probably talk about organizations, how they use AI for internal performance management, or how they use AI for customer-facing processes. That's what information systems more generally does as a discipline. But I mean, if we think about other even distant disciplines like anthropology or sociology or even economics, which is not so close to IS, we understand all concurrent mechanisms that generate AI issues. Like, for example, anthropology, is about all the phenomena surrounding anthropomorphism. So our tendency to see AI as a person or as an entity. And psychology and sociology can explain to us why, for example, now people become friends with ChatGPT. People have crushes for AI bots, and that's shocking. Marketing, going back to my examples from the supermarket, marketing is everything for AI. I mean, if you are a marketing person, probably your best friend is the algorithm, because you no longer call people at home and ask them if they like cookies or bread. You just go on social media and try to scrape as much as you can to understand, consumer preferences. And economics, because it's very relevant to understand the revenue streams of all these algorithmic systems. So it's not that like these lenses change questions, but give more answers, because they explain more in full why, for example, large companies make intense use of algorithms. If I don't look at the economics and the financial parts, so the bottom line of a company, I don't understand why companies seem to do not care about ethics, because they make so much money not being ethical. And by the way, maybe I'm a little bit cynic, but I always think that companies behave ethically when they risk to be fined. Because it's with some exceptions, of course, companies need to generate revenues, need to pay capital, labor, and possibly like expand, grow, etc. So they have to try to use their like tools, like for example algorithms, to generate these revenues and profits. And but so the biggest pain is compliance, really, not ethics. And sometimes compliance equates with being ethical. And then companies have very recently, I think, realized that people don't like unethical companies. So there's also studies in psychology, actually, from 10 years ago that demonstrate that even poor people prefer to pay a little bit more if they know that the company is ethical. Like, think about the case of Nike and offshoring. I mean, people don't like, when companies are not ethical. Companies know that, and so they just try to like behavior. In the worst case, do a little bit of like ethics washing, I guess. Like, think about greenwashing and all the companies that say that they are environmental friendly, but in reality they buy credits for create more pollution, but just paying, just pay for being more environmental damaging. But anyway, that's a different point.
Dr. Marco, for business leaders who see AI mainly as a tool for efficiency and speed, how does your analysis of classification bias and DEI implications challenge the usual metrics of successful AI deployment?
Yes, very true and very interesting. Yeah, AI. The problem of AI is that it does create efficiencies. And so mm, companies like try to replace people with AI, for example, or have less people working on something because AI automate. And the problem is that the more companies do this, the more potential discriminations emerge. Because if I decide to replace a hiring system made of 6 people with a hiring system made of an AI, so at that point, I introduce a classification system that is digital, not analogic, so it's not people, but it's machines, and this can introduce discriminations. It's also important to remember that people also discriminate. I mean, some people are racist, even if they don't know that, right? Think about microaggressions that are generated by people who have just some categories in their mind. Like, for example, someone walks on the street and sees a black person and as an instinct puts their hand on the wallet. I mean, they are not racist, but because of all the movies we are exposed to, because all the media tell us bad stories about, for example, bad black people, have an instinct. That's a microaggression for a black person because they see these things. We don't think that they see these things, but they see these things. And so this is implicit biases, but they happen. So people have these implicit biases, they don't even realize that this happened. So it's not that AI is bad, people are good. Some people are bad, even not wanting to be bad. The problem is of accountability, because if a person, without even realizing that, prefers a white rather than a brown person for a job, well, we can train the people, we can explain to them, that they have to have an approach that should remove as much as possible implicit biases. With machines, it's different because they cannot be accountable. Who do I hold accountable? The programmer, the data, the person who put this machine into place for hiring people. So it's problematic. And second, it's much more difficult to explain to a machine that these implicit biases shouldn't be applied to job positions. So that's, I think, the real problem of accountability.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Your work both summarizes current knowledge and highlights gaps. What are one or two the most urgent open research questions about algorithmic fairness and discrimination in business that you hope other scholars will take up?
Yes, well, actually, these two questions I have in mind is something I hope I will answer. But I think one is on the environment, because I'm now working on the environment, and it's about, AI is very energy resources hungry. And so the more I use AI, the more I virtually generate greenhouse gases. The problem is that this happens not in an equal way everywhere. So in the United States, we use a lot of AI, we have a lot of data centers, so we warm up the planet, but we have a lot of AC. And then in India, there's no AC, and people die because in the United States, we create greenhouse gases, and so the planet, this global warming. I mean, of course, I'm exasperating it's not like that this is happening, but if you think, people who use a lot of AI are also protected by global warming, and people who don't use maybe a lot of AI are the passive victims of global warming because they don't use AI, they don't have AC, and they have hotter summers. So that's one problem. So we need to make sure that we regulate AI in a way that doesn't produce, for example, worse consequences for the global south, for example. And the second problem of AI and generative AI is about how it's used, how it's been used in research. So now people do literature reviews with AI. They do research questions. They sometimes write also papers, which is anyway totally forbidden, but other things that can be done. So I'm concerned that because of the reasons I mentioned before of AI being very biased towards a Western, white, and male perspective, if we do research and we ask an AI to do a literature review on papers, I believe that there's a fair risk that the AI will decide that some papers are more important than others, maybe because they are from Norway and not from Kazakhstan, because that's the mindset of the AI, the way it's trained. And so research is all compromised because then research is skewed. Research will become less credible. Companies will use even less academic research, and the disconnect between practitioners and academics will widen instead of shorten. And that's a problem because we already complained that practitioners read very few of our papers. And then if we start doing biased research with the generative AI, I bet they won't read any of our papers.
Thank you, Professor Marco, for sharing your time and insights with us today. Your reflections on AI, ethics, and discrimination in business offers a powerful lens on how technology shapes justice in organizations and society. I'm sure our listeners will carry these ideas into their own work and conversations, and we are grateful to you for advancing such important dialogue. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an honor, as a pleasure.